Good afternoon, everyone. So in the latter half of the 20th century, there's often one word that is bandied about as the biggest threat to Judaism. I'll give you a hint, it's not Iran. Assimilation, absolutely, right? That is the boogeyman, the bugaboo, that there will be assimilation. But what does assimilation mean? What's assimilation? I mean, everybody has this word, everybody says their assimilation is terrible, but what do they mean when they say assimilation?
Absorbing into something else.
Absorbing into something else.
Absorbed into something else.
Right, so
losing your distinctive. Yes.
So if there is, we'll call that, general society, and we have our, trying to make a Star of David shaped amoeba, and we have the our blob over here. Assimilation would then be that blob moving in here and then disappearing, diffusing into, so that the borders are not sharp. Yes, that would be assimilation. So if I am in general society, oh, you know what? I'm just gonna do it fast. If I'm in general society, but I keep my borders strong, that's fine. What does that look like that's different than that?
There are borders there, and there aren't.
Right, but how? But so this is, I'm outside general society, and this is, I'm in general society, but I still have my borders. What would those borders look like? That would.
Masorti Judaism.
What's that? Masorti Judaism. Okay. So you're saying that outside general society would mean I don't dress like them, I don't speak like them, I don't have a house, I don't associate with them, my house doesn't look like their house, my day doesn't look like their day in any way, shape, or form, my occupation doesn't look like theirs, and there's no interaction whatsoever. Right. Whereas this would be, I dress like the people around me, I have dishes that look like their dishes, but mine are kosher, I eat the same rough kind of animals they eat. They have hamburgers, I have hamburgers, mine are kosher. They go to their job, I go to my job, and the jobs look very similar. It's just when I'm conducting myself Jewishly, not just professionally. And that's fine. Okay? That's not the only type of assimilation or stopping of assimilation. Because we're going to be looking at that process too. All right. What's that?
Coming out of general society.
No.
No.
General
Drawing from general society, even while distinct. Putting general society inside a separate, exactly. We don't think about this as being an issue, but we're going to see from our Torah reading, which happens to be very timely on this topic, as well as our commentators, that assimilation doesn't just mean Judaism going into general society and becoming diffused. It also can mean taking from general society into a distinct Jewish world and then allowing that to be diffused as well, to the point that you can't tell the difference. And that's not one that we're as on guard for, but it's one that is just as much of important to be in defense of. All right, so we're on Parashat Re'eh. Which means we're going to be looking in Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we're going to be starting with verse 28, which is on page 1067. If you're in the Eitz Chaim, it's on page wherever you can find Deuteronomy 12, chapter 12, verse 28, and any other chumash you might be using. All found it? Good. So we're right down at the bottom of the page. Be careful. Do we have a volunteer?
Sure.
Rock, paper, scissors? Okay, got it.
Be careful to heed all these commandments that I enjoin upon you. Thus it will go well with you and with your descendants after you forever. For you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. All
right, so this might be considered the recapitulation, because it gets said over and over again, of you need to do what is right and what is good. You need to follow the commandments, right? Because that creates the right style of life, the path, right? It's nice, clean borders. This is the life you're supposed to be doing. Next page.
When the Lord your God has cut down before you the nations that you are about to enter and dispossess, and you have dispossessed them and settled in their land, beware of being lured into their ways after they have been wiped out before you.
All right, pause there. But does this strike you as being kind of a weird precaution? Right?
Yeah.
We talked about this idea of Jews entering into general society and then dissipating. But the description that's coming here is the general society of Canaanites is gone. So what's the danger? Well, what am I afraid of? Right? I'm going to assimilate with the history. I'm going to assimilate with the rubble of their civilization. How can I assimilate with what has been dispossessed? How can I be lured to follow their ways when they, the people doing the ways, are long gone? Scratching head, reading on. Oh, we got an idea?
Well, they're not long gone. It's the process of being dispossessed. It didn't all happen like that. It was years of fighting, dispossession, if you will, and you can see what they were doing, and maybe some of it looked good.
So you can see what they were doing, because the dispossession wasn't just waving a magic wand and poof, they disappeared, but it was a decades-long process, as we read in the book of Joshua, and then more of the struggles in the book of Judges. But you're saying that while we're dispossessing a group of people, as we are pushing them out because they are not fit to live there, there's something about them that would be so attractive that we would want to emulate it?
Sadly, yes.
Sadly, yes. Well, let's see how what particular things get warned about.
We wouldn't be cautious.
Right.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be cautioned, yes.
Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did those nations worship their gods? I too will follow those practices. You shall not act thus toward the Lord your God, for they perform for their gods every abhorrent act that the Lord detests. They even offer up their sons and daughters in fire to their gods. Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you, neither add to it nor take away from it.
All right. Now, you beautifully did what I was hoping, what I was afraid I was going to have to force you to do, which is you read the first verse of chapter 13. But it seemed natural, didn't it? Right? Be careful not to observe only that which I enjoined upon you. Don't add and don't take away from it. Two very famous concepts that come up a lot in Jewish thought. And then chapter 13 continues. But it almost seems like the beginning of chapter 13 is the end of chapter 12. And I will remind you that the chapter headings are not inherently from Jewish scholarship. That the chapter headings that we use, by and large, with a few exceptions here and there, were invented by medieval scholars within the Christian world. And we realized, that's kind of a handy way to refer to specific verses, rather than just saying, it's that part about such and such. And so we adopted the chapter and numbering, by and large, whole cloth. A few changes here and there. If you look over on the right-hand side in the Hebrew, for those of you that are familiar with Torah reading notation, what's that little pay telling us after the end of the first verse of chapter 13?
That there's a paragraph break.
That there's a paragraph break, right. So in the scribal tradition, there is a break after the first verse of chapter 13, before you begin verse 2 of chapter 13. And that gets mimicked over on the left-hand side, which is, I think, what tricked Kathy into keep reading, even though it was a new chapter, and perhaps indicates that, according to traditional Jewish reading of this section of the Torah, verse 13:1 really is more connected to chapter 12 than to its whole new idea. So we're going to be straddling the two chapters in our analysis today. And we're going to start off with looking at what does it mean not to add or take away from the commandments that we've been given. We're going to start with the chapter 13 section. Oh, almost got it. Because what does it mean to add? What does it mean to take away? Do we add to Judaism? Do we take away Judaism every time we change the style of kippah? Do we add to Judaism or take away from Judaism when we decided that we could cook with cinnamon, whereas before we didn't have cinnamon. Is that adding? Is that taking it away? If people used to eat by dipping their food in salt rather than sprinkling it on the salt, does that mean that by no longer dipping our food in salt, we've taken away from our ways? What does it mean to add or take away? And in particular, we're going to be looking at this adding issue. So Sefer HaChinuch, great place to always start. Not the final word, but a good first word.
Most authorities say that you shall not add does not relate to anything but a positive mitzvah.
Right, the thou shalts. All right, so make sure we got that in our heads. Do not add, according to Sefer HaChinuch's interpretation of most authorities by his day, Middle Ages, don't add is referring to the performance of positive commandments, of how we perform a positive commandment. For example,
The meaning is, for example, if a person puts on 2 kosher tefillin on his head or on his hand, likewise, if someone takes 2 lulavim. So too, if someone sits in a sukkah after the festival with the intention to fulfill the precept of sukkah, although he knows that the proper time for it has gone.
all right? So what we got these examples? What does that mean?
So putting on 2 sets of tefillin, you know, that's adding. Or even after the prescribed time to sit in the sukkah, even though it's a positive thing, it's after the holiday, it doesn't count.
So does that mean I can't sit in a booth in April?
Sure, you can, but I don't think you're fulfilling the mitzvah.
Okay, there we go. All right, so that's a very important part that what he's trying to clarify here is that it's okay to do additional things that aren't mentioned in the Torah, you know, say cinnamon, but don't think you're fulfilling the mitzvah if you do it in a way outside of how the Torah asks you to do it. Right? There are certain things, obviously, that if you tried to do them and they weren't in the Torah, it might be prohibited by the Torah, but if it's just a neutral thing, like sitting in a booth in the middle of April, you're more than welcome to sit in that sukkah. Just don't think you're doing the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah. So too, if you want to carry around a bundle of lulavim, for whatever reason, that's fine. But don't think it's for the reason of fulfilling the mitzvah of shaking the lulav. We might be tempted to think, you know, if 1 lulav is good, 2 lulavim must be better, right? If 1 tefillin is good, 2 tefillin must be better. But this is saying not only don't, but if you do add, you are transgressing. It's not just a question of it's not necessary, it is a violation to have 2 sets of tefillin on simultaneously.
You ever see these guys wear multiple tzitzit?
Well, multiple tzitzit,
The top,
multiple,
More than one of those.
the one you wear on.
they wear a talit katan, they wear multiple of them.
Yeah.
Well,
You ever seen that?
I haven't seen wearing multiple. I've seen people who wear a talit katan and then, of course, wear a talit gadol over during davening. And technically, that's not the same problem because every garment you wear that is big enough to require tzitzit needs tzitzit. And if you happen to wear 3 garments that need tzitzit, then you're going to end up with 3 sets of tzitzit on you. But I would think if you were to put additional tzitzit at each corner, that would be the issue they're talking about here. You know, I've got 2 sets of tzitzit on every corner of my talit because that shows how pious I am. Right? Isn't that the temptation? Right? If 1 is good, 2 must be better, and if 1 is good, then 2 must be even more devout. I'm showing my dedication, my devotion by doubling down or tripling down or quadrupling down or quintupling and so on and so forth. And the Torah is saying, according to our tradition, that no, not only is it not a good idea, it is a violation of Torah to perform the mitzvah in a way that goes beyond the way the mitzvah was supposed to be performed.
So that is in terms of adding to.
Mm-hmm.
We also will discuss later the being more stringent than.
Well,
Or is that part of this?
So being more stringent than is a form of adding to in many circumstances. But sometimes it's a form of refinement, which can be perfectly fine. And sometimes it's a form of doubling down, which falls afoul of this principle. And that's why not every stringency is created equal. Not every stringency is actually helping with the performance of the mitzvah. Many stringencies can get in the way of the mitzvah, which is why, as I've said it before and before, many, many times, knowing the actual mitzvah is very important before you take on a chumrah, before you take on a stringency, so that you know what it is you're being strict about, and you can determine whether or not your strictness is embellishing the mitzvah or helping you to perform it more carefully because you might be prone to mistakes, or whether you are adding to it in a way that goes against this. So it's not a blanket, but stringencies are adding, they're not taking away, although they sometimes can take away from the joy, but that's another issue. Okay, let's get this principle down a little bit more.
For there is no transgression on account of the injunction, you shall not add, unless there is an intention to fulfill a precept.
Right? You didn't break this mitzvah by doubling down on another mitzvah unless you thought doubling down on the other mitzvah was going to help you do the mitzvah. Right? Again, carrying 2 lulavim on Sukkot, no problem. Shaking 2 lulavim on Sukkot, no problem. Saying the blessing and shaking the lulavim, thinking you're doing the mitzvah of lulav, especially well because you've got 2, now we've got a problem.
So too, if someone took up a lulav after the festival, intending to fulfill the mitzvah with it, despite his knowing that the festival was over.
Right? And it's not just a question of doing it wrong at the right time. Doing it right at the wrong time would also violate this. Onward.
Thus, it is also conveyed in Rosh Hashanah 28b, Rabbah said, to fulfill intention is not needed.
Right?
Intention is not needed.
Exactly. This is the lovely shorthand of the Talmud.
Right. To transgress during the proper time, the intention is not needed. If not during its proper time, the intention is necessary.
Hello? Okay. So to expand on what was a very short way that the Talmud tries to say, so Rava is saying that not ideally, but practically, if you shake the lulav during the time of Sukkot, even if your intention wasn't 100% clear and perfect, you still did the mitzvah, right? And if you don't shake the lulav during Sukkot, even if it wasn't your intention not to shake the lulav, even if it was a complete accident, you still violated that commandment because you failed to do so. However, if you try to do the mitzvah outside of the right time, then you do have to be trying to do the mitzvah for it to be a violation of this commandment of don't add. Right? So generally speaking, although intention is desired, right, kavanah is the goal, doing the act is all that's required for success or failure during the normal course of time. When you're outside the normal course, then it depends upon what you thought you were doing. Right? You can wave a lulav around all you want to swat away mosquitoes in the middle of April. But if you wave a lulav in April because you think you're doing the mitzvah of Sukkot, you're in trouble. You've violated this commandment. You got the distinction there? All right, so intentionality. Do you think you're doing a mitzvah when you did that in the wrong time or the wrong way? Becomes very important. Even though intentionality is, I don't want to use the phrase not as important, but it's not as, the success of the deed or the failure of the deed is not wholly dependent upon intentionality when things are in their proper season or in the proper equipment.
So it's not just a neutral act.
Right.
It is something that's a transgression.
Exactly. It's not.
If you take the lulav and you shake it,
and I say, I am doing this.
I am doing this mitzvah.
Right.
It's not that you're just not.
You're not just wrong.
You're not just wrong. You're doing an affair.
You have violated this commandment of do not add. Exactly right. It's that strong of a tone. All right. You might think, why not shake a lulav every month if it's good for the reminders that it gives us about God and the abundance and nature and our connection and dependence on God? Why not do it every month? Right? It's a good message because you would be violating the commandment, do not add. All right.
At the root of the precept lies the reason that the sovereign master who commands us about the Torah is the very ultimate of perfection. All his works and all his commands are wholly perfect and good. Any addition to them is thus a defect, and all the more certainly so anything diminished. This is a clear matter.
Right? The Mona Lisa is a perfect painting. Anyone who thinks that she needs sunglasses is ruining the painting. It's not just a neutral thing. You are adding to what is perfect, and any addition to perfection is necessarily a detraction. Right? That's what perfect means. It doesn't need anything else, and something else is now going to make it worse. God gave us the Torah, and he said, shake the lulav at this time. If you want to shake it at other times, you are able to do so, and if you want to just wave the lulav around, but if you think that you're fulfilling Torah, you're not, because if God had wanted you to shake it as a mitzvah at another time, God would have told you to shake it at other times. But instead, there is a perfection that says you aren't supposed to do that.
So taking your example of if it's an important message at Sukkot, do it every month. If you did it every month because it's such an important message at Sukkot, but did it knowing you weren't performing a mitzvah and did it without any blessing, just doing it to remind you of that specialness, then that's fine.
If you did it for the sake of education, the Shem Hinuch, which is a common phrase used while teaching to say, I'm not doing this because I think I'm doing a mitzvah, I'm doing it so I can educate someone, you could do that. However,
or I just want to remind myself.
However, there is a slippery slope to be faced, which is something I take upon myself as a stringency, an additional act to remind myself, to reinforce this idea in me, and it's identical to an actual mitzvah, can very easily become like a mitzvah in our own mind. The big distinction, of course, would be whether or not you're saying a bracha over it. That would be kind of the kicker. If you think it's okay to say the bracha, then you've definitely gone too far. You've definitely gone too far. All right, let's just finish off Sefer HaChinuch.
This prohibition applies everywhere and every time for both man and woman. If someone transgressed it and added something to the precepts as described, he would violate this negative mitzvah and would deserve whiplashes if there were witnesses, and a warning as is known in every instance.
Right, so this is not just an avera, as Michael was pointing out. This is an avera that would be punishable by lashes in public, if the normal court procedures were followed that are necessary before you can do such things. Yes, you get the person out, hands above the head on the post, and you would whip them for transgressing this commandment.
This would fall into the category of Hilul Hashem.
I mean, as any cat, it's not a specifically, this is Hilul Hashem, but it is as a category definitely an avera, a transgression. Okay, so that's don't add. How in the world does this connect to our don't follow the ways of the people that you are dispossessing? Well, we're going to look at Rashi first, who tries to explain to us what it meant to be lured or ensnared by the people who were there.
Lured or ensnared follows the translation of Onkelos, but the word really means not lured, but seized. May his creditor seize all his possessions from Psalms. Here too, the meaning is that you must beware not to be seized by the desire to act as they did. When you see that I have destroyed them from before you, you must pay heed to why they were destroyed, because of their foul deeds. You must certainly not behave the same way, lest others come along and destroy you. All
right, so he's saying the seize here, it's not just that you're being lured or ensnared. You will be taken hold of, like a creditor seizing the possessions, the collateral, by these practices. And it's because of these practices that the Canaanites were being driven out. Right? We got that as a clear theology here that Rashi's trying to bring home. It's not just that the Canaanites were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were also doing the wrong things. So to imitate their things, just so we're sure here, the Canaan general society, right? Not every general society is the same as the Canaan one. To imitate what they did, to take what they did and bring it into the body of Judaism, would be a big problem. But are we talking about bringing what they did into the body of Judaism, or are we talking about Jews imitating what they did in their society? Well, Rashi's going to give us one opinion on this, and then we're going to see some others.
Up to this point, the Israelites have been warned only not to sacrifice burnt incense, pour libations, or bow down to idols or to any god, for these are the ways in which the one on high is legitimately worshipped.
All right, so let's make sure we got what he's saying here. Idolatry to this point has been defined as serving a false god or an idol in the way that we might serve our God, right? Taking the tools of Judaism and using them for a different god or idol. That's idolatry up to this point before this section of Torah was promulgated.
Here the text teaches you that it is forbidden to serve idols in any way at all. For example, by throwing a stone at a roadside.
Apparently Hermes in the Greek and Roman pantheon was served with rocks as being part of the thing. And so chucking a rock at the statue was part of their idol worship.
Since those happen to be the ways in which these gods are worshipped, such actions are forbidden.
Right, so he's saying here, up until this point, idolatry was doing for idols what we do for God. This is now saying idolatry is also doing for the idols what idol worshippers do for their idols, even if it makes no sense to us at all, because that's not how we serve our God. Right? You might think that chucking a rock at an idol would be perfectly fine because that's not a sacrifice, that's not a libation, that's not bowing down. But no, that's how they serve their gods. Don't imitate that.
But sacrifice, incense, libations, and prostration are forbidden whether or not the idol is normally worshipped in those ways.
Right? Even if Hermes didn't ask for a sacrifice, you're still not allowed to sacrifice to a false god.
What about throwing rocks, thinking you're worshiping God?
Okay, so that then becomes the debate. So what Rashi is saying here is, don't go this way. Right? This is sort of the Rashi opinion, which is there is Judaism, and there's a right way to do Judaism, and there is pagan society, and pagan society has its ways of doing its things, and that mainly is focused around idols. Don't go from Judaism, either with the tools of Judaism or the tools of pagans, towards their gods. Right? So it's all about the idols and the pagan gods in Rashi's opinion. Now we're going to look at some commentators that say no. It's not just about that. It's also about taking what they did for their gods and bringing it to ours. Right? And that's where we're going to see this flow, that sometimes assimilation is not just us disappearing into them. Sometimes it's about taking from others and hiding it within ourselves and not even realizing that we've now made it part of our culture. So let's go on and see what Rashbam says.
Lord, as in Daniel chapter 5, verse 6, and Psalms 109:11, the Hebrew verb means not Lord, but move. Do not let yourself be moved. Do not follow them.
Right, so Rashbam is still a little bit on the edge. Is follow them, follow their ways, not so clear. Ramban is going to drive it home. And Ramban, as he often does, is going to argue with Rashi.
Rashi reads this as forbidding idolatry, but verse 31 shows that he's wrong.
All right, what was verse 31? It's in the italics.
You shall not.
You shall not act thus towards the Lord your God. Right, so what's the real emphasis of this section of Torah according to Ramban? Is it about us worshiping idols? No, it's about how we treat God, how we worship our God.
This passage is not about worshiping other gods, but about not worshiping the Lord in the ways those other gods are worshipped, for a simple reason. They performed for their gods every abhorrent act that God detests. Which
is the second half of verse 31, right? And goes on to talk about the burning of children in the fires.
Up to this point, he has commanded over and over again that when we come to the land, we must uproot the idols and those who worship them and obliterate their name. It must be done immediately, just as soon as we dispossess them. Now we are told that we must not think this is a matter of jealousy, as when human kings condemn to death someone who wears royal garb or puts a crown on his head.
All right, pause there. So what's Ramban trying to rule out for us? That we might naturally think, reading the Torah on first read. Why does God want all these gods gone, these pagans gone?
Because he
Doesn't want competition.
Doesn't want competition. He's jealous, right? It's like a king in the ancient world, at least. And we see this in the story of Purim explicitly. Somebody who puts on the king's robe, someone puts on the king's crown. They're dead. The king is jealous of his standing, of his position, and no one is allowed to pretend to be the king. That is a treasonable offense, not just one that you put someone into the insane asylum for. And Ramban is saying that's not God's reason. God is not saying to destroy the pagan altars and to destroy their ways of worship because God is jealous of these pretenders. It's because of what they actually do that's wrong, not just the fact that it's done for the pretending gods.
The Lord will be pleased when I perform for him all the acts of those nations mistakenly performed for their false gods.
Right, so that's exactly, no, that's Ramban's like false, the person might be thinking to themselves, I can't believe people would sacrifice their kids to this wrong God, when really they should sacrifice their kids to our God. No, says Ramban, you missed the point. It wasn't just that they were wrong gods. It was also wrong deeds.
You shall not act thus toward the Lord your God, for he abhors what they did. What was wrong with their actions was not merely that they were performed for the wrong gods, but the idea that this was how any god should be worshipped. They even offer up their sons and daughters in fire to their gods, an act that is absolutely abhorrent to him, spilling innocent blood, showing no pity to infants. That is why 13:1 is so emphatic about observing only that which I enjoin upon you. That is the real message of this whole section. In fact, the sages understood that worshiping these gods the wrong way, that is throwing a stone at Peor, or even taking care of their shrines, is not a capital offense.
But make sure we got that, radical notion there, because it might be counterintuitive. That if you worship their gods in the wrong way, that's not as bad as using their ways to worship our God. Right? So that may sound wrong, because you might think the worst thing you could possibly do would be to worship a false god. No, the worst thing you can do is worship our God in a false way. That's a much more serious problem. Keep going.
The straightforward sense of our chapter is that we are prohibited from offering sacrifice to the Lord, whether on lofty mountains or on hills or under any luxuriant tree, and also from worshiping him in his proper sanctuary in any of the improper ways that those nations did.
Right? You don't imitate their ways in their place. You don't imitate their ways in our place. The ways they worshiped were what was wrong. Paul?
Yeah, Rabbi, two things. One is, and I know you already spoke earlier about the idea of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
Could this also be viewed as maintaining the integrity of the Torah?
Absolutely.
Right.
But it's maintaining the integrity of Torah, not against an outside threat. That's what is so important, and why I think it's very telling that Ramban, and as we're going to see Ibn Ezra, both see chapter 13, verse 1, as being the end summary of this section, rather than the beginning of a new chapter. Is that it's you don't add and you don't take away, because left to your own devices,
Right.
you are going to absorb things that come from other cultures in ways that will often infect our path, which was perfect, and you're going to get the wrong end of the stick.
One other question. I'm just wondering if this would fall on, one, if this is correct, and two, if it would fall under this paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
There were these series of mystery books back in the 60s, The Day the Rabbi Slept In, the day, right?
I've seen them, yes.
Okay.
Right.
And there's this one anecdote. It takes place on a Massachusetts seashore town, where the Chamber of Commerce or the mayor approaches the local rabbi to bless the harbor and the boats in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, we really don't do that in terms of how we pray.
Right.
Would that fall under this, in terms of that it would be changing the way we worship God?
It certainly could. Similarly, there was an argument in some communities that, we shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving, because that would be significantly changing, one of our holidays, or adding a new holiday and such. There's lots of good reasons why Thanksgiving is perfectly fine, and as well as secular holidays as well. But to do something and to think you're in service of God is the real danger here. It's not just we've never done that before. We've never sung rock music before. That doesn't mean singing rock music now is wrong. But thinking that rock music is now a mitzvah is a problem.
So how do we, in this context,
Mhm.
add Yom Ha'atzmaut?
How do we add Yom Ha'atzmaut?
Right, with prayer and,
Right, so Israel's Independence Day, for those that aren't 100% clear on what Yom Ha'atzmaut is.
like, we're adding a holiday, but we're adding it as, and we have blessings that go with it, don't we? I mean, there are certain things we do for Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Correct. So there are certain things we do for Yom Ha'atzmaut, which I have to point out is controversial. Not everyone in the Jewish world accepted that. Even those that do accept the Jewish state, obviously the ones that reject the Jewish state reject Yom Ha'atzmaut, but even those who accept the Jewish state don't all observe Yom Ha'atzmaut with special Torah readings or Haftarah and additions to the liturgy. However, in terms of those who do, why is this not a violation? It comes under the same heading of the commemoration we have done for other events in the past, right? Hanukkah is also post-biblical, and the personal celebration or family celebration of where a miracle happened for you and your family is something that is mentioned in the Talmud that becomes incumbent upon you and your family because a miracle happened for you, but doesn't become incumbent upon everyone else. And so under that framework, Yom Ha'atzmaut as a national moment of celebration is something that is accepted by many people as being perfectly in keeping with the pattern of commemorating these great events in our national history. Other people disagree and say maybe not, but that we are celebrating is not as much of a contention for those who accept the state of Israel as how you would celebrate, right? So how do we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut? Because it's a good example. Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron together. How are they celebrated in Israel? Do we
Yom HaZikaron is celebrated with,
commemorated?
commemorated.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, there's a moment of silence, there's changing the way the TV.
What is shown on TV,
Right,
exactly.
Right.
Is the moment of silence inherently Jewish?
No.
Is it a mitzvah? No. Do we claim that God commanded us to have a moment of silence for Yom HaZikaron?
No.
No. When we honor the dead with El Malay and with Kaddish and with the other forms of Jewish memorial, do we believe that honoring our dead in that way is a mitzvah? Yes. Right? So we do, even though we have in some ways adopted some of the non-originally Jewish modes of commemoration, a moment of silence, changing of TV broadcasts, wasn't around back in the Torah, although
Right.
choosing what to read is a discussion within the Mishnah on certain mournful days, Tisha B'Av being the most famous. You're not allowed to study Torah on Tisha B'Av because Torah is considered joyous. The things that we add in like that as a cultural embellishment are generally considered fine. Once you say, but this is the mitzvah of how we must do it, then it becomes a bit more problematic, which is why some people do contend that the additional Torah reading and Haftarah for Yom Ha'atzmaut is a problem because we are using mitzvah language for it. I think that's a really good debate, by the way, and one we can have another day. But there is another form that this takes, which has come to light very strongly in the last couple weeks with regards to our resettlement of this land in our most recent time, right? So when we settled the land of Israel, beginning in the late 1800s and going through the 1900s and up into 48, when we celebrated Israel's independence and onwards, many people have very strong opinions about the culture of the people who were living there as a majority at the time. Is that a fair statement?
Fair.
Right? That they're not like us. They do things the way we don't. I mean, look at the way they treat their women. Look at the way they treat minorities. Look at the way they treat other people. Right? We are going to bring justice. We are going to bring righteousness. And we are going to bring Torah, our way of a community. 2 weeks ago, is it easy to still say that? What is the argument for the people that firebombed the house that has now killed 2, as well as the other acts of vandalism and violence that have taken place. Fight fire with fire.
Right.
Right? They say, look, we are under threat by people who resort to terrorism. We are under threat by people who have no rules of war. We are under threat by people who behave disgustingly and abhorrently. If that language sounds familiar, you're paying attention. And the only language they understand is the same. Right? The only way we can stop them is by doing what they do. The only way we can fight back, the only lessons they'll learn is that if they mess with us, is that we will burn them. And therefore, what we are doing is a mitzvah. And they believe that they are doing a mitzvah by copying the practices of the people of the land. And although the Palestinians and the Canaanites are not the same people, they're not the same nation at all. Don't get that wrong impression. The lesson is the same, that we do not succeed in stopping the violence and the hate and the abhorrent practices of those that attack us by absorbing their techniques, their tactics into us, and then calling them a mitzvah, and then saying, I am commanded to attack children. So to the man who went into the parade and killed 1 and wounded many more, because they dared to have a different idea of what a relationship could be. That is also absorbing the behavior of what you see in Syria and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Iran and Iraq, of how gays are treated. And this man felt that was a pretty good idea. He learned it from the people whose abhorrent practices we condemn, and then applied it within our own nation and claims that he is acting for God, that what he is doing is a mitzvah.
How do we counter
Well, we're doing that right now.
that? Well, yes, but we wouldn't have done that in the first place. We wouldn't have gone to a gay parade with a knife and stabbed at people.
The communities from which these people came say exactly the same thing. One of the most interesting repercussions from the stabbing of the parade and the firebombing happening in the same week, and both the perpetrators from both acts coming essentially from the Haredi world, or at least the extremely observant world, for lack of a better word, was that the observant world in Israel said, but that's not us. And how dare you paint us with a brush dipped in the blood that they've shed, because we would never do such a thing. But the fact is, the people did come from those communities, and the language of those communities did provide fertile ground for those ideas to take root. And we too, that is to say, nice, safe, liberal Jews living in America, we have a tendency to feed that, to fertilize that ground as well. When we demonize the other society and say the only way they're going to learn is if we punish them severely, even though for us, in our minds, that may not mean burning a house with a family in it, but may mean destroying their military apparatus ruthlessly without regards for collateral damage, we are still giving cover unless we are extremely precise and explicit in our statements for those who take it 2 steps further. Right? When we say we have to ruthlessly pursue terrorists, how ruthless are you willing to be? And when you say ruthless, do you really mean without compassion? Are you saying that in order to combat terrorism, really, we have to put Torah on the shelf and keep it shut for a few years? Because Torah says we have to be compassionate all the time. Even these cities that we go to, we are told by Deuteronomy we have to offer them peace when we arrive, despite them being called abhorrent and terrible and this lure to us and the snare that's going to trap. We still have to offer them peace. If Torah can say for the Canaanites we have to offer them peace, but there always has to be an option of compassion and mercy if they're willing to stop being the enemy to us. How can we not make sure to always lace our conversations about Israel and the Middle East with similar statements? But within the Jewish community, it's becoming harder and harder to speak with that language and not be called a traitor and not be called someone who is betraying Israel for daring to suggest that peace might ever be possible, or daring to suggest that most Palestinians are not really worthy of the death sentence tomorrow, that most of them are people that are, yes, perhaps too weak to fight against a government and a leadership that is dedicated to goals that are abhorrent, but most of them, they may not love us, but they're not willing to go die and murder us. You know, otherwise the war would be at a very different stage of engagement right now. Susan, you had your hand up.
Yes.
Sorry. I knew I saw a hand over here.
Could it be so simple as to say that type of action if done in self-defense?
It's not as simple to say that you burnt a family house in self-defense. It's not as simple to say you stabbed someone in a parade in self-defense.
Right.
I'm certainly in self-defense.
Certainly
right.
not trying to justify that.
I mean, certainly
But
in self-defense.
Weaponry of any kind used in self-defense is justified.
Weaponry of any kind used in self-defense with a attempt to avoid harming innocents is justified.
Certainly.
As we celebrated or commemorated, depending upon which side of the war you were on, the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were those moral acts? Right? We bombed two cities which did not have much strategic significance at that stage in the war, and obliterated thousands and thousands and thousands of lives, almost none of whom were directly involved in the military operations and campaigns of Japan. Was that really the best way that we could end the war sooner for the benefit of both nations that were engaged? It worked. Lots of things work. You know, Stalin stayed in power because his policies worked. I don't think just working is enough. You know, as we began with on our first verse, be careful to heed all these commandments that I enjoin upon you, and thus it will go well with you and your descendants after you forever. For you will be doing what is good and right in the eyes and the sight of the Lord your God. Right, in the eyes of your God is the literal translation. It's very tempting to say, I know what needs to be done, or I know what needs to be accomplished. Therefore, any way that I do it must be okay. And what God is saying consistently throughout the Torah is, no, you don't know. Sefer Chinuch pointed out, the Torah is perfect for a reason. And if you think you can tamper with the path to the conclusion, because you already know what the conclusion is, and you were willing to ignore the path that God has laid, you've missed the point. The path is as important as the conclusion. And if we can't defend ourselves without being equally as guilty of being a terrorist as those for whom we are defending ourselves, then we sorely lack the imagination necessary to truly be a good people. Because
the ends justify the means, then anything goes.
The ends justify the means, that anything goes. Absolutely.
And I think one can also look at the fact that for a given act or policy, that one of the ways to look at evaluating in more totality is the effectiveness of the act plus the unintended consequences of the act.
Well, and plus the Torah adds the righteousness of the act.
Absolutely. Yep.
That even if it is a successful path, like, you know, you need to go from A to B, even if from here to here works and here to here takes longer, this may still be the right path to take.
Yep.
Because if this one is across the bodies of innocents, that's not the path we have been commanded to take, even if we end up, so to speak, where we want it to be. Although I have severe doubts that if we get to be through this path, that we're really going to enjoy be the way we wanted it to.
Right.
You know, if we get to peace over the corpses of 18-month-old babies, I don't think that the peace is going to be of the shape and form that we can truly say we are proud of. And this challenge right now, within both Israel as well as within the Jewish community here, is to remember that we are not just fighting for security and survival and peace. We are fighting so that we can be good and right in all of our ways. We are fighting for the perfection of God. And we can't win by sacrificing that.
You know, it just, in my mind, there's no way that I can imagine a Jewish terrorist thinking that killing is the way. I mean, you know, firebombing a family, you know, that kind of killing, as opposed to somebody's attacking
soldier versus soldier, or
Exactly.
soldier versus terrorist. Yes.
You know, I cannot see how that computes. The guy that shot Rabin, you know, how he could think that computes.
They think that computes the same way that the Muslim terrorists think that blowing up a cafe is what Allah wants. It is the same thought process. And indeed, the people that they've begun arresting in Israel, which is a wonderful first sign, and we'll hope that there'll be more arrests and prosecutions afterwards. Their plan, as they laid out very explicitly, was that you do things like this, the firebombings, the vandalism, in order to stir up trouble, so that there will be more violence against Jews, in order that the Jews will fight back harder and drive out these enemies. So what they were doing was not to increase the safety of the Jews in the short term at all. They wanted more Jewish deaths in order to push the government to be more extreme, in order that there could be then more deaths of our enemies. And if that doesn't sound like the terrorist handbooks that we continually uncover from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas that seek the death of their own side in order to spur the survivors into more acts of extremism, then you haven't been following the news. And if that isn't exactly what was being warned about in the Torah, of absorbing the practices of the people that we have pushed out because of their abhorrent practices, then we're missing the point. And if you think we will be proud of the Jewish successes that come from following the practices of these types of people, then we're in really, really bad shape. We're in big trouble. And the thing is, we don't have to. Right? When people ask, well, what's the difference? The difference is doing what the IDF has consistently done since the beginning, which is to have the highest and most rigorous standard they can for the moral use of force in defense of our people. And the IDF has been a model for that. Recently, more things have come out, you know, of recent events, and much of that has to do, I believe, with the exhaustion the IDF has felt of trying to be moral continually in the face of a society that produces so much hate and so much terrorism against us. But we can't allow ourselves to be tired of being right, or else you can't tell the difference between the two sides. You know, the world has already decided there was moral equivalency between us. We can't decide that as well, and decide that if there's moral equivalency, we might as well behave as badly as them. We might as well use the tools that they've used to get us over the barrel by exploiting our attacks against them to generate more anger against us.
I don't know so much that it's the moral equivalency. I think it's that almost regardless of what the IDF does, it is condemned for. And meanwhile, right next door in Syria, hundreds of thousands of innocents are losing their lives constantly, and there's no
But we don't stand in judgment before the world court.
Oh, I
We
understand,
stand in judgment before a very different judge. And that's, if you could read just the final quote from Ibn Ezra.
Do not say, I will worship the Lord in those same ways, and think you are doing the right thing. God detests all of their practices. They even offer up their sons and daughters. So be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you.
Right? That's our standard. Our standard isn't, well, if we could get the rest of the world to admit that we're so much better than Syria and all these others, which we are by every objective moral calculus, then we'll bother being moral. It's is this the right thing that God has asked us to do? And if it's not, it doesn't matter whether the world ignores us or doesn't ignore us, or whether it ignores Syria or doesn't ignore Syria, or whether it could care less about the dead in Libya or the dead in Sudan or the dead throughout the rest of the world and only seems to focus on Israel's moral failing. I don't care. I don't care what the rest of the world thinks. I care what we think, and I care what God thinks. And that has to be what we continually come back to, and why we must advocate that the IDF be the noble soldiers that they are. And they must be the noble soldiers that they are against our own fanatics and terrorists as much as they are against the other side. And that may make it difficult for certain coalitions to stand. That may make it difficult for politics to continue as usual, but that may not be such a bad thing. We need to be able to be us and to be right and good if we are going to truly win, because the battle is not just beating them, or else we become one more state in the Middle East whose only claim to fame is no one can kill me more than I can kill them. That's not why we're there. All right, take care. Prayers with Israel, and please remember, when you speak about Israel, when you speak about the peace process and Israel's security, that you are standing on the side of right, and that always has to be as part of what you say to someone else. You can say Israel has the right to defend itself, Israel has the right to fight back, Israel has the right to go after with every muscle in its body those who would attack it, because Israel wants peace. Israel doesn't want to have to kill those that have come against us. Israel doesn't want those societies to live under fear of their own leaders or of our reprisals. That's why we do what we do. And that's why Israel does what it does, how it does. And that has to be our gold standard.
Thank you.
Okay, there's actually two checks in there.
Oh.
One for